perceive the world around us, here and elsewhere, the time that passes, the space that we occupy, the nature that surrounds us. How do we experience physical suffering? How do we perceive our death and that of others? How, from one culture to another, are considered some structural elements of our way of understanding the world. We propose to question some transversal elements, founders of most cultures, that can help to explain the plurality of human beings' visions, religion and the scared, tradition, history and political cultures. Depending on the country, professional sector or person, these three elements are more or less entrenched, visible or homogeneous, but everywhere they constitute deep cultural sources, which largely determine representations and practices. First, we'll begin with the subject of religion, which is a founding pillar of most cultures.
What are we talking about when we talk about religion? It's an institution, a mythology, a protestic discourse, a corpus of texts, a set of rites, a home groups, a community of faithful. In one way or another, all these dimensions have an influence, but they do not mean the same thing. We propose here to distinguish religion as a system of attachment to sacred elements and faith in one or more deities. Christian religions, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, animism, and so on. It should be noticed, however, that the word religion is absent in some languages, particularly Bantu languages. Spirituality, which can concern the religious but also refers to a posture of differentiation of body and mind, or search for meaning distinct from sacred dimension. We were thus able to speak of spirituality without God, with regard to Oriental spiritualities, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism. Westerns can never really know how to define them as they escape their own cultural patterns. Overall, the message of Buddha, Confucius, or Lao Tzu seems less religious than secular. Almost all the fathers of Eastern wisdom propose above an ethic of life of several and a way of considering the relation between human beings, between man and the cosmos, a true philosophy. Belief, a word that can refer to a religious belief, but not only. It should be noticed that the term is often pronounced with distance, conditioning, or skepticism, and with unattended connotations. Superstition, credulity, idiotic throws, spells. The distinctions with religion is the more important to stress that religions are often attributed practices and behaviors that are linked to belief of a different natures, while each religion has its own characteristic and coherence. It actually brings together very diverse human groups with very heterogeneous level of theological knowledge and its intensity of very difficult practice and statements of faith. Nothing is more misleading than to assimilate a religion to its foundationalist currents. As Dunya Bozar points out, it is individuals who determine the understanding of their religion based on who they are and what they experience. We never encounter cultures or religions, but always individuals who appropriate elements of culture and religion that are themselves in constant change and interaction. Inter-religious dialogue is always an extremely delicate exercise. It can take place at different levels. The personal levels of shared religious experience, mixed marriages, shared religious ceremonies. The level of shared actions, such collaboration between Catholic and Islamic relief services. And finally, the theological level, which is the most difficult and perhaps the most adventurous dialogue. According to Dennis Guerra, this dialogue requires a number of common sense rules. First, do not look to others for what is important or significant to us. Example, to say that the Dalai Lama is the Pope of Buddhists when his function has nothing to do with that of the head on the Vatican. Or to see God in Buddhism, or conversely, a Buddhist who wants consider Jesus Christ as a Bodhisattva, a being dedicated to supreme awakening. Second, recognize the limits of words, recognize that gap exists between what each puts behind seemingly identical words. 3. Have an organizing principle. Organize, or rather recognize your own thinking enriched by the ideas of others. In other words, no anti-religious dialogue without rooting in one faith. 4. To judge the tradition of the others, these summits, and not by products. And finally, admit that two things can be radically different without being diametrically opposite.
For the historian Michel Meslan, tradition is a set of attitudes and behaviors that refer to a past to guide person action, that to awareness of an identity principle that links generation. All over the world, the reference to a founding past flows is in the present, even when it's not explicit, and is rather linked to a collective unconscious. It is not just simple conservatism, an era imitative reflex of the past. There is, according to Chardin Masculier, a very strong dialectical relationship between tradition and topically conservatism and innovation. In reality, in the past plays such as a great role, it is because the present man deciphers better than in his present the founding and the permanent element of a whole life. Custom, a way of acting established by use, is a notion close to tradition, but is mainly used by lawyers, for whom it is defined as a normal legal use by time and accepted by the population of given territory. In cooperation activities, reference is often made to customer law, which, although is really predominant, is only few countries. Mongolia, Sri Lanka, has a significant place alongside civil or constitutional law in many other regions of the world, China, West Africa, and so on. The notion of right is closely linked to the last two, since the right is set of customs defined by tradition and custom, and not by law. Rights are characterized by repetitive, codified, and often symbolically charged acts. They are very far from being limited to the religious sphere. Even if the sociologist Emile Durkheim points out that the profane ritual follows rules similar to those of the religious ritual. The parade which recalls the procession, the speech which recalls to the sermon, the civil marriage which recall religious marriage, and that it ultimately has the same function as celebration of collective feelings or the integration of individual into social life. Many discourses on tradition are marked by exotism and certain simplism. Few observational precautions are therefore necessary to avoid any illusions about this all-purpose concept. The distinction between tradition societies, rural, collective, past-oriented, sacred, and modern societies, equal, individual, future-oriented, in that it would imply that culture are homogeneous, is no longer of great relevance today. Defining tradition by simple opposition to modernity often leads to a reference to Western modernity, as Olivier de Sardin points out when he denounces this Western habit of thinking that everything that does not correspond to Western modernity is part of traditionality. There is, he adds, a specific African modernity. Today's possession cults are different from the old ones. The genes are not the same. Islam has changed. Traditional practitioners do not trace at all in the past. We must stop referring what is the different from the West to the traditional frozen in the past, a reflection shared by many sociologists who speak of multiple modernity, alternative modernities, or with Jean-Claude Guilbault, mixed modernity, a consequence of repatriation of tradition by which formerly colonized people says in the culture imposed by the colonizer the adequate instruments to rediscover and repatriate some of their own traditions until then forgotten and misunderstood. The tradition itself, moreover, is constantly being reinvented. There are, as the author of the Dictionary of the Humanities, music, dance, cuisine, religion, and the arts call them traditional as opposed to others that are less traditional or not at all. Often it is enough to scratch a little to erase the illusion of the age of purity of these legacies. Traditions are not fixed, and the practices of the present contain many seeds of future tradition. Chateaubriand is attributed the famous formula: tradition is an innovation that has succeeded. Finally, the reference to traditional values is one of the remedies to which everyone refers, more or less strongly, but is not sufficient to define the diversity of the value systems on which our partners rely. The main challenge is therefore to understand the different individual strategies for using tradition or avoiding it, depending on the context of dialogue or interest involved.
Despite the progressive globalization of management methods in companies, administrations, and third sector organizations, adherence to traditions and rituals is far from being a necessity in the store of antiquities or folklore. They are also to be taken very seriously in international partnership relations. Two very different questions can be kept in mind. What is the place of traditional values in the culture of the other? All those who have had the opportunity to work with Indian partners have not failed to be struck by the importance of the values and traditions that have emerged from the many influences that have marked the history of the subcontinent: Hinduism, Islam, migratory movements, colonization. These traditions are therefore marked by significant degree of syncretism, but they present themselves today as a relatively coherent whole. Despite the significant change that westernization has caused over several decades, Indian filmography gives a striking and very contemporary idea of this. Bollywood only reflects the influence of traditional values in the representations of social order in India, an influence that is strongly reflected in the daily lives of Indians, including in the workplace. Another striking example of the encounter between extreme attachment to tradition and extreme modernity. Arranged marriages are increasingly taking place in India, though websites that allowed parents to find parties for their very young daughters that correspond to their wishes and sometimes their community, without the word caste being necessarily used.
The historical heritage and political culture of the different territories in which we work make it possible to shed light in certain behaviors, representations, and cultural reflexes. However, historical legacies are very diverse. History is often rewritten, and political cultures are changing. But first, let's clarify the meaning of the words. Historical and political heritage refers to a set of socio-political events of the past relating to a country, a region, a people, which influence the current conception of our interlocutor and the relationship we can establish with him. The challenge is to understand what's the heritage and historical capital, what are the traumas and sequelae of wars, colonizations, and so on, that can both determine specific representations and practices and play in our relationship. Collective memory is defined by Pierre Nora as referring to the set of memories, conscious or not, of an experience lived or mythified by a living community, of the identity of which the feeling of the past is an integral part. It reveals, affects, consciousness, emotion, passions. It is open to the dialectic of memory and amnesia, unaware of its successive deformations, vulnerable to all uses and manipulations, susceptible to long latencies and sudden revitalizations. It is therefore a central element to be taken into account in understanding what makes us act and makes our interlocutors act. Collective memory and political heritage are largely nourished by a series of myths, popular or literary narratives, featuring supernatural beings and imaginary actions, in which are projected fantasized memories of events experienced by people or the structures underlying their family behavior and social relationships. These found in myths, more or less historical, more or less legendary, legitimize a social order, gives groups their cohesion, and inspire behavior. Far from being an outdated stage of human thoughts, myths are the form diverted from the laws of society's organization. History, especially bloody history, has often proved to be the creator of lessons found in myths. Burma, Thailand, Turkey, Armenia, France, Algeria conflicts that can freeze intercultural relations. It is important to keep this in mind in order to diffuse possible instrumentalizations of history in partnership relations. It is also linked to the colonial past. Many French people have been able to measure during professional or private periods in Africa how much colonization has left its mark. In many countries of the former French colonial empire, more than half a century after independence, reactions of great ambiguity can still be observed, attributing to the white man power or know-how that is often superior to reality, but also by continually questioning his intentions and attributing to him a neocolonial strategy. Counter-examples are the most telling in this field. Ethiopia is a country known to have never known any colonization, other than the very brief one from 1935 to 1941 of Mussolini's Italy. For this reason, the relationship in which Ethiopian pride feels no threat, and which encourages the expatriate not to expect any added value from his situation as a foreigner, just as it preserves him from any feeling of resentment on the part of nationals. Similarly, China, a country that has known little colonization, except for the concession period, is very proud of its independence.
Thus, whether it is religion, tradition, or history, the sources of cultural representations are each shifting and evolving, and their mutations often have their mutual influence. Religion, tradition, history, collective memory, and political cultures are in constant interaction and influence most human practices.